It's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Germaine Greer. We're delighted that tonight we are joined by one of Australia's best-known intellectuals, a writer, academic, journalist and scholar. Germaine Greer is the author of 12 books, most recently on Rage and the acclaimed Shakespeare's Wife. She is Professor Emeritus of English Literature and Comparative Studies at the University of Warwick. I will now invite Professor Greer to say a few words about Penn's Day of the Imprisoned Writer and then to introduce Larissa Behrendt, and after Larissa's lecture to draw her out in conversation, and following that conversation, questions from the audience are welcome. Would you please join me in welcoming Germaine Greer?
Now, it's now my pleasant duty to introduce Larissa Behrendt. Larissa Behrendt is Professor of Law and Director of the Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney. This is such a dry account of who Larissa is. It's hard to keep a straight face. Larissa completed a Master of Laws and a doctorate at Harvard Law School. Shades of Barack Obama. In 1994, watch out, I may not be kidding, in 1994 and 1998. She is a member of the ULAI Kamilaroi Nations of Northwest New South Wales, and in 2009 was named the NAIDOC Indigenous Person of the Year. Her first novel, Home, was the winner of the 2002 David Unaipon Award for Indigenous Writers and also won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book in the Southeast Asia Pacific region. Her second novel, Legacy, has just been published by the University of Queensland Press. Now, as you know, I shall be having a brief conversation with Larissa after she's delivered her lecture, and I think I don't really need to say more about her at the moment because she will give a better account of herself in her lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Larissa Behrendt.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation whose land we're on today, especially to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal elder Pat Turner, who's in the audience tonight, who's been a great mentor of many women of my generation. I'd like to thank Penn and Cal for giving me the honour of presenting this lecture tonight. And thank you, Germaine, for agreeing to be the respondent. I'm sure your presence here has more to do with the fact that it explains why we were oversubscribed tonight more than mine. But I would like to just acknowledge the fact that you've been such a great supporter of Aboriginal issues, but also of many of us on an individual level as well, and we thank you for that. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. My father was 5 years old when he was placed in a home. He grew up in a time and a place where he was made to feel ashamed of his Aboriginal heritage and his darker skin. But these attempts to make him feel ashamed of who he was only made him feel more Aboriginal, not more white. My father believed in rights to land, language and culture, and like every Aboriginal person I know, he also believed that education was the key. He worked tirelessly with the Aboriginal Education Consultative Group and the Aboriginal Studies Association. He set up the Aboriginal Research and Resource Centre at the University of New South Wales, and some of his papers are lodged here in the State Library. Dad was forced to leave school at the age of 14, so to end his career running a university research centre shows his determination and the depth of his knowledge. He also became heavily involved with Link Up, the organisation that reunited Aboriginal families affected by the policy of removing children from their parents. And in all of this work of assisting Aboriginal people in finding their families, of encouraging them to study, on working to ensure that more non-Aboriginal people were educated about Indigenous issues, he defined his experiences and aspirations using the language of rights, and he believed that better protection of human rights for Aboriginal people was a key part of our political struggle. Watching my father's practical devotion to his work while he used the language of rights, seeing him articulate a vision that included a stronger framework of rights protections, is perhaps what made me always sceptical about the false dichotomy that began to develop during the Howard era, that argued that you either had practical things like health, education, employment and housing, or you had big picture rights ideals. This oversimplification completely misrepresented the way that Aboriginal people framed their political aspirations. There was no divide between rights and what would become known as practical reconciliation. Instead, there was a desire for equal rights and also a claim to rights that flowed from the unique position of Indigenous people, rights to land, culture, language and political and economic autonomy. There was also the belief that the recognition of rights would transform the playing field on which Aboriginal people interacted with the rest of Australia. But despite all the progress made between my father's generation and mine in terms of access to education and other rights, many Australians, while perhaps agreeing with the assertion that Aboriginal people are entitled to the same things as other Australians, are uncomfortable, even suspicious, about the language and concept of rights. While happy to watch Cathy Freeman win, hang Indigenous art in their homes or offices, comfortable with the cultural performances at the beginning of events like the Olympic Games, and even happy to acknowledge Aboriginal people at the beginning of a social event with a welcome to country, there is little support for the protection of land, cultural heritage and languages or any other right that would assist in supporting and sustaining Aboriginal culture. Yet the concept of human rights are more pervasive and universal than the parochial debates about rights in Australia would indicate. From the American and French revolutions to the anti-slavery movement, from the works of Vattel and Vittoria to those of Thomas Paine and John Locke, notions of inherent rights have been developing around the world. They developed into their contemporary form after World War II, as Europe reeled from the aftermath of the excesses of the darkest sides of human nature. In fairness, it's not just Indigenous rights that make many Australians feel uncomfortable. Similar anxiety is expressed about the talk of human rights in relation to other minorities, especially Muslims and asylum seekers. And this is the legacy of an impoverished culture of rights within the Australian community. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a powerful speech on the 13th of February 2008, giving a national apology to the Aboriginal people, the stolen generation, who had been taken from their families as part of an assimilation-based policy. In that speech, Rudd said, "The truth is, a business-as-usual approach towards Indigenous Australians is not working. Most old approaches are not working. We need a new beginning." There are many reasons why the old approaches were not working, and two are of particular note. The first is the classic cost shifting between federal and state and territory governments. Since the 1960 referendum delivered to the federal government the power to make laws in relation to Aboriginal people, but left the states and territories with residual powers, there has been an increase of areas where responsibility is shared between the two tiers of government, including across areas such as health, housing, education and heritage protection. But instead of working in a cooperative spirit to ensure targeted policies, programs and resources, we see either the unnecessary duplication of services or the underinvestment in key areas as these two levels of government seek to shift the blame for policy failure and the responsibility of resourcing to each other. The end result is the underfunding of basic Aboriginal health, housing, education and employment. And while these key areas remain under-resourced, we see a targeting of funding at other programs that are not proven to solve underlying issues that lead to poor socioeconomic status. To take just one example from the previous government's attempts to deal with issues in the Indigenous Affairs portfolio, the first year that shared responsibility agreements were used by the Howard government as a thinly veiled attempt to swap basic services or much-needed infrastructure for behavioural changes such as face washing and tidying yards, only 25% of the earmarked $100 million made its way into actual Aboriginal communities, with $75 million going to administration. The reasons why Indigenous health, housing, education and employment are underfunded but money is spent on things like shared responsibility agreements is that too often in Indigenous affairs the solutions are driven by ideologies, not by what the research shows works. And this is the second repeated failure of past approaches. They are driven by ideologies and not by evidence. Indigenous policy is full of ideologies. They permeate the shapings of its policies and programs, many of them recycled from previous eras where they were equally unsuccessful. These include the ideologies of assimilation and mainstreaming and the newer ideologies of mutual obligation and shared responsibility. It was the national emergency that was sitting neglected for over 30 years. In the wake of decades of reports, each with in-depth analysis of the issues and complex blueprints on how to address the immediate and underlying causes, the federal government announced that it was finally going to prioritise the endemic violence in some Aboriginal communities and relied on a recently commissioned report by Pat Anderson and Rex Wild. The federal government intervention into the Northern Territory was designed in a 48-hour period and unveiled by Indigenous Affairs Minister Mal Brough on the 21st of June 2007. It included many measures, including alcohol restrictions, the claim that welfare payments would be linked to school attendance, compulsory health checks, forced acquisition of townships through compulsory leases, increased policing, banning of pornography, the scrapping of the permit system and the appointment of managers to all prescribed communities. While the promises of additional resources for policing, medical checks and housing were welcomed, other aspects of the policy approach raised immediate concern. It made no reference to the research or understandings about what actually works on the ground. The rhetoric of doing what was in the best interests of Aboriginal people or children masked a list of other policy agendas, particularly changes to land tenure and welfare reform, that were completely unrelated to effective approaches in dealing with the systemic problems of violence and abuse, and instead sought to undermine community control over Aboriginal land and resources. The overall approach of the intervention was paternalistic and top-down, and it did not seek to include Aboriginal people in the solutions and the outcomes. The two aspects that caused the most concern were the quarantining of welfare and the requirement of leases over Aboriginal land in exchange for housing money. The quarantining of welfare payments was included as part of the intervention with a seductive rhetoric that it would be linked to school attendance. And I think this played well with an electorate who probably assumed that poor attendance rates and poor educational outcomes for Aboriginal children were caused by the poor parenting of Aboriginal parents. An evaluated trial of a scheme linking welfare payments to school attendance in Halls Creek found that the attitudes of parents of Aboriginal children were only one of the factors that affected school attendance, and it pointed to the central role that the quality of the teaching and the quality of the school culture play in school attendance and performance for Aboriginal children. It also found that the housing situation in Halls Creek, where overcrowding is a critical problem, is unlikely to provide an environment where families can be school-ready. There is no evidence that shows that linking welfare to behavioural change is effective. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the imposition of such punitive measures in an already dysfunctional situation will exacerbate the stress in a household. There's plenty of research that shows what does improve attendance and performance for Aboriginal children, and they include things like breakfast and lunch programs that bring the Aboriginal community, especially elders, into the school, Aboriginal teachers and Aboriginal teachers' aides, curriculum that engages Aboriginal children in what they're learning, and programs that that blend the development of self-esteem and confidence through engaging with culture, along with programs that focus on expectations of academic excellence. These effective programs and strategies highlight the importance of building a relationship between Aboriginal families and the school in order to target issues like school attendance and performance. And it suggests that rather than simply punishing parents for their children's non-attendance, the government should be providing schools and teachers that meet the standards and the needs of the Aboriginal community. It cost $88 million to make the initial administrative changes in Centrelink to facilitate the first round of welfare quarantining. Yet not one additional dollar was spent in the intervention on any of the types of programs I've just mentioned that were proven to engage Aboriginal children in schools. And there is also plenty of data that shows that the Northern Territory spends about 47 cents on the education of Indigenous children for every dollar spent on the education of non-Indigenous students, partly because they fund by attendance, not enrolments. So many Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory don't have enough teachers, classrooms or desks for all of the children that reside in their communities. A punitive measure placed on families to ensure children come to school is hypocritical from any government that neglects the same children by failing to provide adequate funding for a teacher and a classroom. And even if it did work to physically bring more children into the classroom, what's the quality of education they'll receive when there's been an underinvestment in teachers and educational infrastructure? But the problematic nature of the welfare quarantining policy as part of the Northern Territory intervention doesn't stop there. Despite the rhetoric that there was a linking of welfare payments to school attendance when the policy was rolled out, it wasn't applied just to parents whose children did not attend school. It applied to anyone who lived in an Aboriginal community described as a prescribed area who was receiving a welfare payment, whether their children went to school or not, whether they even had children or not. People who had managed their money their whole lives suddenly found their income quarantined. To achieve this, the federal government prevented the Racial Discrimination Act from applying, suspending protections and rights of appeal under the Northern Territory anti-discrimination legislation as well, and also suspending the rights to appeal to the Social Security Appeals Tribunal. It took away the right to complain about unfair treatment to any of the usual tribunals and forums from the most marginalised people within our community. Barbara Shaw lives in an Alice Springs town camp. She has her own children, but often looks after others. She has supported her family her whole adult life. She found, with no consultation, no notice, her income was suddenly restricted by quarantining. Barb is nobody's fool, but she had problems navigating the system at first. She finds her ability to travel restricted because the store card she is issued with cannot be used in other states. She knows people who cannot travel for sorry business or cultural business because of these restrictions. She knows women who, like herself, could not afford Christmas presents because of the restrictive way that the quarantining works, and it's also impossible to buy white goods. Barb, who has always provided for her family, never neglected her children and always focused on their education, resents that Centrelink used to segregate the lines between those whose income was quarantined and those who weren't. There were only black people in her line. She also resents the separate queues at the shops and has on more than one occasion been confronted by shop owners angry and frustrated with the card system. She cannot tell how much money is left on her card, so sometimes she does not have enough for her purchases and has to take items back. Barb has taken her complaints about the welfare quarantining system to the United Nations, since there is no forum within Australia that will hear her concerns. There are some stark differences between the treatment of housing in the community sector and Aboriginal community-owned housing at the national level, which has come to play as part of the Northern Territory intervention. Housing in the community sector is the responsibility of the Minister for Housing, Tanya Plibersek. Aboriginal housing falls under the Minister of Indigenous Affairs' portfolio, Jenny Macklin. Plibersek has been supportive of what she thinks community-based housing organisations can provide and has observed that they are good at tenancy management, often have lower rates of rental arrears and better track records at maintenance than state housing authorities. By comparison, Macklin does not support Indigenous community housing providers. She has policies aimed at closing down the sector in favour of mainstream state-based public housing. She does not have the same confidence in the Indigenous housing sector that Plibersek has in the community housing sector and seems to believe that they are poor managers and that maintenance is a problem. This is part of the thinking in why Aboriginal communities are being made to sign lease agreements in order to access housing money. Macklin has said that Aboriginal communities would benefit from the strong regulatory framework provided by the state. At the same time, Plibersek has recognised the failures of mainstream public housing authorities to deliver. Of the same system, she has said, we are often not delivering opportunities for public housing tenants. 90% of the stock is held by 8 government providers and our system is not transparent or accountable. Plibersek supports the transfer of the title of public housing from state and territory housing authorities over to the community housing sector so they can provide housing. Macklin has a completely different attitude. She is insisting that the title of land on which community housing is built must be transferred from the Aboriginal community to state housing authorities through long-term leasing. Housing will be delivered by government housing authorities, the same one that Plibersek has described as not transparent and accountable, and is contingent on communities leasing their land back. If they don't lease the land, they don't get the money. This is the housing policy that Macklin has stuck tenaciously to as part of the Northern Territory intervention, and it has now been rolled out in other states. More questions have been asked after the $800 million housing program in the Northern Territory didn't deliver one new house in 18 months. Walpri Elder Harry Nelson Jacamara has said, "The intervention housing program has not built any new houses at Yuendumu. We are just being blackmailed. If we don't hand over our land, we don't get our houses maintained or any new houses built. We have never given away any Walpri land and we're not going to start now." Barb Shaw has also challenged Macklin's attempts to acquire a lease over the Alice Springs town camps. She, like many other Indigenous people, wonder why our rights to land have to be surrendered for access to housing money that other Australians can access without any such guarantee. Minister Macklin has started the process of compulsorily acquiring the town camps of Alice Springs if a lease is not signed. In the meantime, overcrowding occurs in the town camps and the government refuses to release any money for repairs. Richard Downs is a tall, striking, soft-spoken Aboriginal leader from Imbloodawatch, a town 3 hours from Alice Springs. Imbloodawatch were taken over with a 5-year lease that came with the promise of new housing. The housing stock was transferred to the Northern Territory government's housing provider. No new houses were built at Imbloodawatch and much-needed repairs did not take place. By July this year, the town was overflowing with raw sewage. A plumber was supposed to be on his way, but his truck broke down, the community was told. They packed up and moved to a camp 6 kilometres from the town. They fundraised privately to get a bore running and to build showers and toilets at their new site, and they have become fierce critics of this aspect of the intervention. Richard Downs has said, "We are fed up with the federal government's Northern Territory intervention, controls and measures, visions and goals forced onto us from outside. We have been waiting with patience to see where this intervention was heading, hoping there may be some humanity and compassion towards our Indigenous people, some respect to bring us back into the discussion process, to have a say in what's happening in our community. Instead, our leaders and elders are treated with contempt, show no respect, degraded, treated as lower-class outsiders." When the intervention was first rolled out, the Howard government silenced critics by accusing anyone who didn't support all of the measures of protecting pedophiles. The Rudd government have implied this too. It has continued to avoid the policy debate that the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory deserve with the constant use of the phrase, "We just care about women and children." Government spin is masking many problems. For example, Macklin claimed she had evidence that the intervention was increasing the consumption of fresh food because more was being sold through community stores. When questions were asked in Senate estimates about how these claims were substantiated, it was revealed that the basis of the evidence were 10 phone calls to community stores asking whether there was an increase in fresh food sales. 6 said yes, 3 said no, and 1 said I don't know. Now, not to denigrate the usefulness of phone surveys, but more complex questions need to be asked. For example, who was buying the food? Those whose income was quarantined, or the people, the army and an army of public servants, coming in to roll out the intervention. Despite the claims of Minister Macklin that there's more fresh food being consumed, she supplied no hard evidence of this, especially since there was no survey done of fresh food consumption before the intervention to compare current consumption rates with. Irene Fisher is the kind of Aboriginal woman who makes a whole town work. She doesn't wait for governments to give her solutions and dollars. She's the kind of person who knows everyone in her community and has that leadership by example that exerts moral authority on those who live with her. She is the CEO of the Sunrise Health Service. It operates in the region east of Katherine and covers about 112,000 square kilometres. All but one community in that area are prescribed areas and so subject to the intervention. Sunrise Health Service has been collecting data since before the intervention and has been able to compare its current data with data from before. Its data indicates that anaemia rates in children under the age of 5 in the Sunrise Health Service have jumped significantly since the intervention. From a low in the 6 months to December of 2006 of 20%, which is still an unacceptably high level, but one which had been reducing from levels of 33% in October 2003, by June 2008 it had reached 55%, a level that has been maintained in the 6 months to December 2008. In 2 years, 18 months of which has been under the intervention, the anaemia rate in that area in children under 5 has almost trebled. And at 55%, those results can be equated to early childhood anaemia levels in Iraq and Zambia and are worse than those in Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Algeria. The Sunrise Health Service has also seen a worrying rise in low birth weights amongst babies from 9% in the 6 months leading up to the intervention to 19% by December 2008, almost double the pre-intervention rate. The national figure for Indigenous babies is 14.3%, so from doing better than the national average, they are now 20% worse off. Low birth rate has a variety of causes, including poor nutrition amongst mothers, and is also associated with anaemia. Government sources have sought to discredit these figures, but Sunrise Health Service has been doing medical checks on 96% of the children in its area. The intervention health checks only screen 74%. Other health concerns have been raised by the Sunrise Health Service about the compulsory quarantining of welfare payments. They have documented instances in which the rollout affected people's capacity to purchase food. This included diabetics who, when they had no local store access, were unable to get food and simply had to sleep until food became available. Irene also believes that the regime of income management has not reduced alcohol or drug consumption. Indeed, alcohol restrictions on prescribed communities has merely shifted the problems to larger towns and bush camps. And it has not stopped humbug or the conversion of basic card purchases into cash for grog. She says that there's also no evidence that it has increased the consumption of fresh food amongst Aboriginal families, which is vital to help fight anaemia.